Well, hello, seventh graders. Today we're going to talk about lesson 2, dealing with the French and Indian War. Today we're going to analyze the effects that European colonization and warfare had on the Native American societies that were living in North America. In class, we're going to talk about a quote. I'm just going to bring it up here. The British and the French are like the two edges of shears, and we are the cloth caught between them. And we're going to talk about how this was said by a Native American chief regarding how the Native Americans often feel like they're caught in the conflict, the fighting forces between the British and the French. The British and the French don't really hurt each other, but anybody in between them are the people getting torn apart. And this is definitely the case for the Native Americans. Indigenous or native societies in North America had been there for tens of thousands of years, some estimates as far back as 20,000 years. And there were many different tribal societies and civilizations that existed throughout North America and South America of indigenous people. And these people were subject to horrible mistreatment by the European colonists, then eventually by the American government, to every degree, subject to slavery, disease, exploitation, and frankly, genocide. And in many ways, the European colonists were a great threat to the native societies. But remember, the native societies had lived in America for generations upon generations upon generations. So oftentimes the tensions that they had with each other kind of blinded them to the greater threat of the European colonists. If I am a Huron and my family had been at war with the Iroquois for 200 years, it's kind of hard for me to see past that antagonism, that conflict, towards a greater threat of the Europeans. So we often see that native societies are often divided against each other by the Europeans, and these differences are often exploited, unfortunately. And because the Europeans are looking to compete against each other to get control, to expand their dominion, we see that the natives who live here are often caught in the middle of their fights and battles, and often have to choose a side since the war is on their soil, on their land. Of the two sides that are affecting the North American indigenous societies, you have the French and the British. And to many native societies, the French were seen as the lesser of two evils. Why? The French mostly lived in North America as fur trappers. They didn't build large cities. They didn't build large homes. They didn't build large settlements. They didn't build large farms. For the most part, they were runners of the woods, as they called themselves, where they would live off of the land, hunting, collecting furs of animals that they could then trade in Europe and make a lot of money. There's a huge demand for fur in Europe. And because they aren't seen as necessarily competition to the natives in way that of destroying the land, destroying their way of life, like the British are, and because that natives that the French are willing often to trade and cooperate with native societies, and often will even live among them. We see many French fur trappers and Native American women often are married to one another. One of the most famous examples of this is Sacagawea. Sacagawea is the famous guide of the Corps of Discovery, who helps them in so many ways be a successful mission to explore the territories in the West gained by the Louisiana Purchase and make their way to the Pacific. They wouldn't have been able to do it without Sacagawea. If you look at this coin with her on it, this dollar coin, you can see that she has her baby and the papoose on her back. Her baby's name is Jean-Baptiste, which is a French name, not a Shoshone name, as Sacagawea was. And the reason why her baby has a French name is, well, her husband was a French fur trapper. And Her baby, who was with her the entire time through the core discovery, bore a French name. So since the French treat the natives with more respect, we see that often when conflict breaks out between the French and the English, native societies like the Algonquin and Huron are more likely to side with the French because of that mutual respect. Now, don't get me wrong, they'd rather that the French weren't on their land, in their territory. But again, in the choice between the French and the British, many native societies side with the French. Do all of them? No. Some of them side with the British. And the reason for this, in many ways, is because the British are excellent at using divide and conquer strategies. The British often try to pit native societies against one another. This is a tactic that the British use in Africa and India, Ireland, and multiple places where they colonized, where they tried to get the people who live indigenously in an area to fight one another so that way they can be weaker and easier to beat. And they often exploit this in many different ways, and we're going to see that the U.S. government will continue that tradition after the British are no longer in power in North America. One tribe that sides with the British is the Iroquois. The Iroquois had a powerful confederacy. They had a good amount of power in the area of upstate New York. They're a large group that actually founded one of the first democratic societies in North America and had been democratic for hundreds of years. And they side with the British because, well, the Huron and the Algonquin, who were enemies of theirs, sided with the French. So they didn't really care too much about the French. They're like, well, wait a minute. I hate the Huron. If the Huron are fighting with those guys, then they're my enemy. I want to hurt the Huron or the Algonquin. It wasn't so much about hurting the French or loyalty to the British as about hurting their adversaries that they had been fighting against for generations. And unfortunately, again, this will work out poorly for the Iroquois and other tribes, whereas if they united together against the greater threat of all the European powers, especially the British, they might have fared a bit more successfully. So, exit card number 2 is why did the Native American tribes, most of them, side with the French after war broke out between France and England? And why did some tribes, like the Iroquois, side with the British? Write your answer. I can't wait to read it on Google Classroom. Have a great day.